what happens then with the parting of the ways, and with the ascent of Christianity into power, is that social criticism from the margins comes to be attacks on a marginal people, against a marginal people, the Jews, from the centers of power. And so this is this is the kind of context in which this teaching of contempt that will really kind of define Christianity's relationship to the Jewish people emerges. And then it's accompanied by what I think is fair to say, a consensus of scholars today appreciate as a misreading of the New Testament, of both the Gospels and of Paul, that comes from these kinds of social dislocations of the church from its Jewish origins, of the church from its marginal place to a position of power.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. We've got another excellent episode for you today. So excited. My guest is Dr. Tzvi Novick. He is Abrams Professor of Jewish Thought and Culture at the University of Notre Dame. He's an expert in rabbinics literature, and he also is just really great, does a great job of translating things for a popular audience. In addition to some of his more technical works, he's written an introduction to the scriptures of Israel, history and theology, and the book we're going to be discussing today, which he wrote for his class at the University of Notre Dame that he teaches on Jewish theology, Judaism, a Guide for Christians. I have been waiting for this book for quite some time, and I'm really excited to discuss it today with Tzvi. We only scratched the surface of some of what's in this book. So I just want to encourage everybody at this outset, before you even get any further into this, make sure you get a copy of this book, get copies for friends and family. This would make a great book discussion. If you're part of a group that does book discussions, each of the chapters have sections for further inquiry. So you can go more into, he's got suggested readings, all kinds of really good stuff. It's such a rich book. You're going to want to dive into this further. And again, as you're going to see in this interview, we get into some really complicated topics and just scratch the surface of what you can expect in this book. So I'm hoping that this interview just whets your appetite and encourages you to go out and get copies, multiple copies of the book. Hey, if you are new to this channel, or you've been watching us for some time but you haven't yet followed, please, if you're listening on podcast, make sure that you are following us, and do leave us a rating and a review. That would be absolutely fantastic. If you're watching us on YouTube, make sure that you're subscribed to our channel if you're not already, and like and leave a comment on this episode. That would be fantastic. That just really helps us out a lot as we continue to try to grow the reach of what we're doing here at the Center for Bible Study. We appreciate you a lot as our audience. We always want to hear from you, especially if you're a regular viewer, what we can do better, how we can better serve you. This is something I do, as you know, on the side, in addition to all the teaching and other stuff I do. And I do it because I love connecting with people, and I love making good scholarship available to more and more people. So this book is definitely that. I think you're going to really enjoy it. And so without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our interview with Tzvi. All right. Well, welcome everybody back to the podcast. I am so delighted. We've got an excellent episode for you today. A wonderful guest, Dr. Tzvi Novick, is joining us all the way from South Bend, I believe, probably.
That's right. Well, in Chicago now, but
in Chicago now.
Regularly in South Bend to teach.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So he teaches at the University of Notre Dame. Tzvi, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to discuss your book, Judaism, a Guide for Christians.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah. So, fantastic book. I like I was telling you before we jumped on, this was exactly the kind of book that I've been looking for a long time. So I'm really excited to put it into the hands of students and others.
Right.
Could you just give us first just a little bit of your background, kind of what got you into study of a more kind of, I guess, intense academic study of ancient Judaism, biblical studies, this kind of thing, and a little bit about who you are, what you do.
Sure. Yeah. So the focus of my study is ancient Judaism. I mean, I am modern Orthodox, a modern Orthodox Jew, and so I got a pretty traditional modern Orthodox Jewish education, and I really got into the study of kind of the academic study of Judaism or of ancient Judaism through an interest in Hebrew and Hebrew grammar. That was really kind of what initially grabbed me. A great professor at Yeshiva University, where I did a master's in Bible, Richard Steiner, who was a brilliant Semitist. And yeah, so that I guess was my entry point. I also kind of came with a great interest in law, and actually did a law degree, kind of an abortive legal career, brief legal career. And so that also kind of enhanced my interest in thinking about Jewish law.
Mm.
And so, yeah, then I went on to do a PhD in ancient Judaism at Yale with, under Professor Christine Hayes and,
Mm.
Stephen Fraud. And, yeah, and so I was particularly interested in the question of law and ethics in early rabbinic Judaism, the question of different normative structures within rabbinic Judaism, kind of complicating the idea of a straightforward deontological structure where the main categories are must not, may, and kind of complicating that by suggesting that sort of the normative categories that are familiar from virtue ethics are also kind of intrinsic to rabbinic law. So, and that's a topic that I continue to work on. I've also kind of entered into the tradition of liturgical poetry, Jewish liturgical poetry in late antiquity, which is really kind of fascinating points of conversation with Christian liturgical poetry, Samaritan liturgical poetry. So
Mm.
I guess that's the core sort of historical research that I do. And then I came to Notre Dame right out of graduate school, and with a familiarity with Christianity in its Second Temple context, but not really with extensive familiarity with Christianity as a living tradition or with Catholicism. But there, of course, yeah, you get an education precisely in that,
Yeah.
and I had the opportunity to be teaching Judaism both at the undergraduate level, uh, and um, and really kind of had to think about how to teach Judaism within the framework of a Christian department of theology, a Catholic department of theology. And this book really ultimately emerges from that teaching experience.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks for that background. So let's talk then about kind of the impetus for the book and
Mm-hmm.
the need that you see, and as teaching a class in Jewish studies in a Catholic department,
Mm-hmm.
which is an interesting kind of
Yeah.
element in and of itself. How did you approach that, and how have you conceived of that, and what have been some
Mm-hmm.
of the things you've learned or the challenges that kind of come about from that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I guess the first thing that I kind of came to appreciate was um, that it's important to be doing two things together.
Mm.
Right, there are, I guess, like two main. I feel that kind of Christianity is um, there are sort of two different kind of sorts of things that Christians, from the perspective of Christian theology, ought to know about Judaism. One is the history of Christian teaching about Judaism and contemporary theology of Judaism, what Christianity has thought, what it thinks about Judaism, about the church's relationship to the Jewish people, and then the other is kind of Jewish theology, kind of knowing Jewish theology, and these things are interrelated, especially in this in this moment of in the case of many Christians, in this post-supersessionist moment
Mm.
of reconciliation in one way or another, to one degree or another, with Judaism. So that is a move within the history of Christian thinking about Judaism, and it's a move that naturally raises the question of, well, if these are now, if this is a people in whom we are in relation, if the Jewish people are in one way or another in right relation to a degree, to one degree or another, with the God whom we worship, then we ought to know about Judaism as a living tradition and not simply as a historical matter, Judaism at the time of Jesus or the like, or the Old Testament. And so I wanted to write a book that really thought about the two of those things together. And Yeah, and the teaching, the class out of which it comes, does those two things together. Ideally, of course, right, these are huge topics. You would devote two separate classes to them, one to the history of Christian teaching about Judaism, and one to Jewish theology. But it's helpful to interweave them
Yeah.
as a matter of as a practical matter. You don't know if you'll get students for two courses, so you want to kind of be. But in any case, so intrinsically they belong together, and so
Yes.
that's the
Yes.
idea here.
Yeah.
And I guess just in terms of, you asked about sort of the felt need for it. So in part, I guess that's the thinking in terms
Hmm.
of keeping these together. In terms of, I guess, um, the desire to write the book at all, I suppose I have felt, particularly the longer I've been at Notre Dame within a Christian context, that there is a certain sense, and I'd be interested to know whether you get that sense as well, that 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 the problem or the question of the church's relationship with the Jewish people is something that we have largely addressed, right? There was the kind of the crisis of the Holocaust
Hmm.
kind of brought things to a crisis, and then there was the hard work um, uh, of of thinking through the church's relationship with the Jewish people in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And that is something that we have kind of largely settled, kind of solved, addressed. And now the church kind of confronts other problems. And it seems to me that's kind of step. I mean, with all of the work that has been done
Hmm.
in recent decades, in the past half century and beyond, um, that that a lot of work remains to be done, and
Hmm.
that the work that has been done has kind of created a sort of commitment to a relationship with the Jewish people, but the theological significance of that commitment, kind of the implications of that for all aspects of Christian theology itself, haven't
Yes.
really kind of fully been explored.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. I think that, and I also think there's a huge disconnect between the academic wing and the
Hmm.
kind of lay level, right? In terms of, like,
Right.
I think academics now expect, like, yes, we assume supersessionism is bad and we've moved beyond that. But like you said, on the one hand, we haven't really teased out, well, then what exactly does that mean moving forward theologically
Hmm.
for Christians? And then on the lay level, I think it's still just a huge problem of translation. I teach Bible at an evangelical school, and I find myself constantly explaining basics of Judaism, to
Hmm.
Christians in an
Yeah.
environment where, you know, I think it was Amy Jill Levine said something
Lebanon.
like, "You don't need to make Judaism look bad to make Jesus look good." Um,
Right.
but that
Yeah.
move has been going on so long
Right.
within
Right.
Christian
And
theology that it happens for people so intuitively and naturally as Christians they don't even realize they're doing it.
yeah,
Um,
that's right. I do actually enter that into that right in the book a bit, and
yeah,
the framework that I use is Phil Cunningham. I guess coming more from a specifically Catholic context. Phil Cunningham in St. Joseph University, he writes about the oppositional imagination,
yeah,
right? This kind of
yeah,
reflex to think about these things in opposition,
yeah.
and right, and others have written about the ways in which the lectionary, right, kind of choosing texts, kind of if we choose an Old Testament text and a New Testament text, there is the sense of wanting to set it in opposition. And the truth is, I mean, I think it's important to kind of appreciate that this isn't kind of just some vestige of unprocessed supersessionism. I mean, I think there is uh, I mean, if one is committed to the idea, the centrality of Christ, and Christ does have to represent something new. If he represents something new, that has to have it missing in one way or another beforehand. And so, uh, it's really, it's not a matter of banishing that reflex, I think, but of kind of appreciating uh, where it can go wrong, nuancing it by bringing the continuities to bear. So yeah, it's a complicated question.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and I think you say it at the very outset of the book, something to the effect of, Christianity can't really conceive of itself without Judaism.
Hmm.
Something to that
Yeah,
effect, and
yeah,
I
yeah.
think that's
No.
exactly right. I mean,
Mhm.
it's just it is the case. You see this kind of dynamic going on in Acts of the Apostles, for example, right,
Hmm.
where like this new movement is trying to be, the authors trying to conceive of the development of this new movement, but it can't conceive of itself outside of the story of Israel, like that. That's not.
Hmm.
It's a necessary kind of theological challenge.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
um, I don't necessarily want to. You don't have to go into depth in this, but I do think this is a really valuable piece of the book, one of many. Just your basic introduction to the development of Judaism today,
Hmm.
and one of the reasons why I find this so helpful, again, is I mostly have taught Bible in predominantly Christian contexts. And
Yeah.
when people find out that I have come from a Jewish family and everything like that, they start asking me all kinds of questions like about Judaism. They're so basic, but what I realize is a lot of Christians, um, they only know Judaism of ancient Judaism that's been preserved for them in the text, and so they don't
Yeah.
understand like why are Jews doing different things today. So I think just
Yeah.
having a little bit of a basic awareness that like the Christianity that's happening today in 21st century America is not the same Christianity that was happening in the first century in Palestine, like
Right.
Israel Palestine. It's the same kind of thing. So yeah, could you just give us maybe just a really quick overview of a couple of the key developments that you outline in the book? For I think people
Hmm.
would appreciate
Yeah,
that.
sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. Tough to kind of condense that, but I would say, right. I mean, the key thing to appreciate, I suppose, is that the main form of Judaism that exists nowadays, not the exclusive one, but by far the main form is the form of Judaism that emerges from the interpretive program the rabbis of late antiquity, from roughly the first century of the Common Era through to the sixth century. They produce a canon of legal and interpretive texts that really define the future of Judaism. And Judaism today, since the 19th century, with somewhat earlier roots, there are denominational divides in the West, and very complicated stories to tell about the nature of those divides. But even those that have veered from the tradition are still entirely working within, or veered from the tradition to a greater extent than other denominations. They are still very much working within the framework of a Judaism as defined by the rabbis. So, with the exception of these small groups, Karaites, Samaritans, essentially Judaism today is rabbinic Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it very much kind of represents there are, there's a fundamental continuity in practices and beliefs, with what one finds in the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, and the Old Testament. There is a fundamental continuity, in the sense of a people Israel, this self-conception of being a single people, from Abraham through to today. And that's a kind of fundamental aspect of Jewish theology. But at the same time, you've got that canon that is the starting point. One could in some ways analogize that canon to the New Testament. So the New Testament is for Christians as the oral Torah, or the rabbi's interpretive canon, legal canon is for Judaism. That analogy is imperfect, but I think it is fair to say that just as we can't understand Christianity without the New Testament, we can't understand Judaism today without the rabbis.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and that's really helpful. Um, for I, so, in your context, teaching in a Catholic institution, I would imagine the idea of a living tradition of rabbinic Judaism makes more sense, in a Catholic context in some way, in the way that both, I guess, within the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church, albeit differently, they conceive of the living tradition
Hmm.
Protestants have this whole Bible only, or some Protestants have this kind of Bible only sort of thing. That seems to me to be I don't know, you say it, that a very different way of thinking about tradition, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting to think about kind of when you have this kind of rapprochement then between Christians and Jews, right? To what extent does kind of, yeah, I guess say a Protestant commitment in terms of its own understanding of Christianity require a similar expectation, as it
mhm,
were,
mhm,
of the Jewish people. I think that depends a lot about kind of how one is understanding the relationship with the Jewish people, and it's interesting to, yeah, to think about, yeah, whether it's uh, yeah, whether, I mean, there is a kind of automatic reflex that if we ourselves are interpreting our Christianity in terms of the Bible, with a certain suspicion about tradition, or at least the way that tradition is developed,
yeah,
there's going to be that kind of almost automatic expectation that Jews will do the same. But
mhm,
really, if we bore down theologically, is that really required? It's an interesting question to think about.
yeah,
It's not
yeah,
one, I guess, that I engage with.
yeah,
Um, explicitly in the book, because I suppose um, I guess I'm thinking first and foremost, or the book emerges in the Catholic context, as you say, but certainly it's an important question to ask. Though ultimately, right, as I say, there are the scripturalists within the Jewish tradition.
yeah,
Karaites, the
right,
sect that I mentioned,
right,
comes from the Hebrew word mikra, scripture. So they are the kind of scripturalists. But certainly, Judaism, as we know it today, for 99% of Jews today, is rabbinic Judaism.
yeah, yeah. No, that's right. I was trying to think. I was wondering if Karaites are like the closest analogy to the move in I guess in some wings, especially of Protestants, like the Bible only kind of
Hmm.
crowd or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah. Okay, great. Well, we've already kind of mentioned this, but I think it'd be helpful to get into this a little bit more. You've got a lot of good stuff on this. The kinds of supersessionist moves
Hmm.
within Christian theology. So
Yeah.
you discussed punishment supersessionism and economic supersessionism. Could you define what those are and yeah, and just kind of give us some examples of that? I also thought it was helpful that you show that the context in which the language happens matters. I think you use the analogy of I can't remember who you're drawing on, but punching up versus punching down
Ah,
kind of
yeah.
thing,
Right, right.
um,
Hmm.
which
Yes.
kind of gets at like when time and context in which an author is, deploying that kind of rhetorical technique, and that I mean, it doesn't maybe absolve it, but it helps explain the differences and how that changes when
Hmm.
power dynamics shift and so forth. So,
Yeah, sure, sure,
yeah.
sure.
So anything you'd like to share about that, I think is really, really great.
Yeah, yeah, sure. So, right. So that, I guess that's this is the basic framework for trying to summarize the development of Christian teaching about Judaism. So if we're talking about kind of the classic teaching of contempt, anyhow, as it emerges from antiquity and as it defines the teaching of Christianity really until quite recently. I mean, the most natural way, well, once the church becomes Gentile, the most natural way of thinking about of thinking about the church's relationship with the Jewish people, is that God had this relationship with the Jewish people, and then the Jewish people are replaced by the new people of God, i.e.,
Mhm.
the Gentile church, and this is supersessionism. And then I distinguish between punishment supersessionism or punishment supersession, because I just want to kind of describe it as a doctrine rather than necessarily an ism. But I can just use these terms interchangeably: punishment supersessionism and economic supersessionism, where punishment supersession, these are two different ways of accounting for the end of God's relationship with
Mhm.
the Jewish people within this supersessionist perspective. One being God's relationship with the Jewish people ends as punishment for their rejection of and killing of Christ, deicide. And then the other is the relationship comes to an end because it was always there was an expiration date when God kind of
Mm.
establishes his relationship with the Jewish people. It's always intended to come to an end with Christ. It's only a kind of prelude to a new relationship with the world that begins with Christ. And so that is economic supersessionism. Economic meaning connected with the governance of the household, or God's governance of his household, i.e. divine providence. This was the divine plan. And those two ideas go together. They're compatible because a development can be causally overdetermined. So there can be multiple reasons for why this happens. And so you see Christian authors, early Christian authors, embracing both of these ideas, often in the same paragraph. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess where the question of punching up comes into play, or punching down. So that's the story of kind of how this teaching of contempt emerges, right? How is it that a circle of Jewish Christ followers comes to transforms to a church that kind of takes the Jewish people to have been rejected and to have been replaced by the church. And so uh, so uh, I suggest that there are kind of two developments that are that explain this transformation. One is one is, of course, the parting of the ways, right? Where precisely this Jewish, the circle of Christ followers, becomes largely Gentile, overwhelmingly Gentile, and ceases to identify with the Jewish people. And the other is this transformation of a socially marginally, politically marginal group to the reins of power. That is to say, the emergence of Christendom. And so, but so the key idea here is that we find in the New Testament, in some of the earliest church fathers like Justin Martyr, like Melito of Sardis, we find this critique of Jews, the charge of deicide, connected with a history of killing the prophets. We find the idea that charges of blindness or ingratitude, and those charges in themselves are kind of continuous with a prophetic critique of Israel that we find in the Old Testament, that we find in the Hebrew Bible, that Judaism itself then necessarily embraces. But the key idea, though, is that in origin, those critiques are social criticism.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's someone who identifies with the Jewish people and is critiquing them because he, as the voice, channeling the voice of God, wants them to be better. And he is that social critic is attacking the structures of Jewish power often. And Amos is your classical prophet in that respect. But Jeremiah also. These are critics of kings and the powerful, and wanting them to embrace a better vision of Jewish society, because they are themselves Jews and they want to see the society with whom they identify be better, be more faithful to what they take to be God's vision. And so, but what happens then with the parting of the ways, and with the ascent of Christianity into power, is that social criticism from the margins comes to be attacks on a marginal people, against a marginal people, the Jews, from the centers of power. And so this is this is the kind of context in which this teaching of contempt that will really kind of define Christianity's relationship to the Jewish people emerges. And then it's accompanied by what I think is fair to say, a consensus of scholars today appreciate as a misreading of the New Testament, of both the Gospels and of Paul, that comes from these kinds of social dislocations of the church from its Jewish origins, of the church from its marginal place to a position of power.
So yeah, that's really helpful. So we have like two kind of different things going on, where there's the strategy of taking Jewish prophetic discourses and wielding them against the Jewish people from a position of someone who initially from people who also identified as Jewish, but they believed they'd found the Messiah, to then several generations later, people who are no longer Jewish, but are arguing that they are the rightful inheritors of this identity because they're following the right Messiah. The Jewish people, by and large, have missed it, but they're still a marginal group. To now, like, a fundamental shift in power dynamics, to where now all of a sudden they're the ones in power. They have, and now they're wielding that same language against a marginal Jewish people. And so it's the language plus the power dynamic shift that we have to kind of account for in this unfolding saga of how supersessionist language is played out, kind of thing.
Yeah. And these are sociological shifts, and they're also kind of accompanied by hermeneutic changes, by theological, by changes in interpretation. But then of course, and then it becomes dangerous once these are mingled with power. Yeah,
right, precisely. And so then that part of that legacy coming more into kind of the modern world would then be the anti-Semitic deployments of this in modern context to oppress and marginalize Jewish communities, like in
and you use the term anti-Semitism, and this is something I also want to intervene in the book, that we do sometimes, and to a certain extent, I think rightly, distinguish between modern anti-Semitism and traditional Christian anti-Judaism. We think about traditional Christian anti-Judaism as a matter of hostility to Jewish religious beliefs, which can be cured by conversion. Modern anti-Semitism, we tend to think of classically in terms of racial categories, and hence kind of immutable and inescapable. But one of the arguments that I make in the book is that while that's true to a certain extent, and certainly anti-Semitism, say, as it finds its ultimate expression in Nazism, is very different from traditional Christian teaching. There is nevertheless a way in which traditional Christian anti-Judaism does itself go to Jewish character, and isn't merely about kind of Jews having a mistaken set of beliefs, because Christianity, again, because it needs to explain to itself, to understand its relationship with the Jewish people, needs to kind of give an account of why the Jews have rejected Jesus, why the Jews in this traditional ESI charge killed Jesus. And in the course of developing that explanation, they develop there emerges kind of a well-developed and very negative understanding of Jewish character. It's carnal, it's blind. And so there is that kind of continuity then between Christian anti-Judaism in that respect and modern racial anti-Semitism.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely helpful, and it's right to make that connection. They can't be completely neatly separated out. The one naturally, maybe not naturally, but definitely flows into the other for sure. Great. Okay, thanks for that. Could you talk to us a little bit about the way that rabbinic Judaism develops, and the study of Torah, kind of like what that entails, what that looks like? I think it's so fascinating to me that when you get into like the rabbinic literature, you're engaging with series of conversations where people disagree on the answer to a whole host of questions, and those disagreements are just sort of preserved for people to then consider. And it strikes me as such a different way of reasoning in some ways than many Christians are used to, where a lot of Christian communities, right, if you disagree with somebody on certain issues, like, you can't be part of the same community. You might not even be Christian, right? Depending on how and then you have in Judaism, this developing tradition where it's like, to be part of this community is to be part of the community that engages critically with these arguments, where people are constantly disagreeing with each other, and learns to navigate through that. It's very different. And like you said, it is focused on halakha primarily. It's a legal reasoning, which
Hmm.
also can have negative connotations in Christianity, right? So
Right,
yeah,
right. Yeah. So yeah.
take us
So
through all that.
yeah,
I think
yeah.
that'd
A
be
lot to unpack there. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, it's just so there is a story, and I don't get into this in the book, but there is a story in which the very emergence of rabbinic Judaism is a response to sectarianism, right? You have a Second Temple period, late Second Temple period, sectarian context in which you've got Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, others, Zealots, etc. And in the wake of the destruction of the temple, the rabbinic Judaism emerges in the in the first century into the second century of the Common Era as a big tent that insists on the idea that we can debate and disagree about the law, but we are not going to fracture on that ground. That there is a um, um, right, these and these are the words of the living God. Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim is one expression, famous expression of that in rabbinic literature. So I think that story, from an historical perspective, needs to be kind of complicated a little bit, but I think there is something to it. But however it figures in the emergence of rabbinic Judaism, it certainly does uh, characterize the way in which Torah, kind of the study of the Word of God, even the implementation of the Word of God, but especially the study of the Word of God, occurs through debate and argument. Where again, yeah, the purpose, the key thing is the debate and not the resolution of the debate. And it's a matter not just of the sort of what the texts look like that you read. You read the text and it's full of debates. It's also a matter of how the text itself is studied.
Mm.
Right? This traditional method of study of rabbinic texts is through chavruta, through study pairs.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an enactment, a kind of performance of the texts themselves, right? So the Talmud is full of debates, and the way you study the Talmud is with a study partner and probing the different reasons and carrying on that debate. So yes, so it ends up being very much a culture of debate, and there are many different ways of accounting for that. One model that I kind of tried to bring to bear in in the book is that uh, of a modern philosopher, theologian, David Hartman,
Mm-hmm.
who suggests that this sort of way of going about engaging with God's word represents a sort of um, this sort of extensive, sophisticated engagement with the intellect represents a kind of stage in the well, I mean, one could say emancipation of human beings, but that I think maybe has the wrong connotations. It might go too far,
Kind of like a
because
maturation process
right, or
almost.
maturation, right.
Yeah,
I wouldn't want
yeah.
to say emancipation from God, but there is right, but a maturation process, right, in which the relationship between human beings and God isn't simply a matter of it doesn't simply revolve around the question of obedience and disobedience, but it rather resolves around the question of interpreting the meaning of God's word. Before we can even get to the question of whether to obey or disobey, there's the question of what did God say, and there's the recognition that well, that's a hard question to answer, and we need to be debating that, and that God kind of sees it as human beings to be doing that. So yeah, so that's really a kind of one of the, I think, fair to say, defining features of Torah study as it emerges in rabbinic culture. And it has these kinds of, and this is, or at least it could be interpreted as having these implications in theological anthropology, that is in the way we conceive of the nature of human beings. Right? So that perspective implies a certain optimism about
Mm-hmm.
human beings,
Mm-hmm.
about their capacity to interpret God's word, that they're not that they can do it in good faith, even when they're disagreeing. Those the disagreement isn't going to lead to a kind of polemical desire to simply beat the other, even though that is recognized. The rabbinic literature itself
Hmm.
recognizes the temptation, within this framework to simply win rather than to debate in good faith and with a desire to really see the truth of God's word emerge. Um, but the system has its arguably implies a certain commitment to the idea of human beings being capable of doing well, of acting well.
Hmm.
Um, right, as a result, of course, of the nature that they are endowed with by God. So it's not something kind of separate from God or God's grace, but it is fundamental to human nature.
Hmm. Yeah. So if I'm kind of hearing you correctly, understanding when I'm reading the book, it's the act of interpretation and kind of interpretive debate is something God freely invites human beings into in the
Hmm.
process, entrusts human beings with, I guess I should say. There's a kind of trusting on the part of the divine to give human beings, the community, the task, the work of interpretation, which is conceived of as the like highest act of worship in some sense, right?
Hmm.
If
That's
I got
right.
it
That's right.
correct.
Yeah, and right. The idea is that God can even model that by inviting Abraham, by inviting Moses to disagree with him.
Yeah.
Abraham around the question of the destruction of the Sodomites, uh, and the rabbis kind of multiply in their interpretation of the Bible. They read the Bible in ways that are kind of multiply those instances. So they find them even so there are some of those that arguably are on the very surface of the biblical text, but the rabbis in rereading scripture in their midrashic project of interpretation, of narrative interpretation of the Bible, they often introduce other cases or kind of find by rewriting biblical stories other cases in which um, in which prophets, patriarchs are challenging God, and
Yeah.
God invites that challenge. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. So what? So kind of get summary view. What does Torah study look like for Jews today? Like if you grew up, in a traditional Jewish home, how do you develop in that process from Torah to Talmud, and what does that kind of look like?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and so I mean, I can certainly speak to kind of an Orthodox context, um, and there is but I should say, right, that there is a serious engagement with Torah in non-Orthodox contexts as well, and again, kind of these rabbinic texts are at the core of all forms of all of the denominations of modern Judaism. Yeah, I mean, that's just, I suppose I'd begin by just by just highlighting the centrality of it and the beauty of it. I mean, it really is the Talmud is conceived of as a sea. Uh, there's no end to engagement with Torah, and it really is just a pleasure to pick up the Talmud and read it through. There are difficult, these can be difficult texts, but you're sort of transported into a world, uh, when the outside world or when contemporary news can be difficult, it really is I mean, I don't want to call it an escape because it leads you back out into the world because everything in there is ultimately the primary interest is in clarification of the law, that is to say, how one should act in the world. And so, but at the same time, right, you kind of pick up on a discourse that is centuries old and engages with fundamental values and how to translate those fundamental values into specific actions. Uh, so uh, so it's really kind of um, yeah, a kind of a joy and incredibly meaningful to do. Acquiring literacy in it is a challenge.
Hmm.
It's made much easier today by the existence of fantastic translations. All of the major texts of the rabbinic corpus have been translated. They're available online with hyperlinked kind of commentary, and so that makes it so much easier nowadays. But still, to be kind of fully conversant things are inevitably lost in translation, and to be fully conversant with these texts in the original, that requires extensive education.
Hmm.
And one begins with the typical curricular track is to begin with the study um, of the Hebrew language, and with the Pentateuch, with the five books of Moses, the Chumash, and then from there you're going kind of both into biblical commentary, actually not so much rabbinic commentary, but medieval Jewish commentary, which is based on rabbinic commentary, and then you're also progressing into that oral law, the rabbis' commentaries, and you're doing that first with the Mishnah, kind of this foundational
Hmm.
rabbinic legal text, and then to the Talmuds, the commentaries on that. Um, and the Talmuds kind of occupy a greater and greater part of one's time in studying these texts, because yeah, they take a lot of time. So in a modern Orthodox high school, you might devote an hour and a half a day to the study of Talmud. There are ultra-Orthodox high schools where you'll devote half a day or more to the study of the Talmud.
Wow.
And then it's not something you really ever end with. It's a common practice in modern Orthodox Judaism to take a gap year after high school before starting college, and to study at the yeshiva, kind of an institute of higher learning, typically in Israel. And there the Talmud might be almost the entirety of the curriculum. There'll
Mm.
be three distinct study sessions in Talmud, one that's going from 9 to 1, another one that's going from 2 to 4, and another one that's going from 8 to 10.
Hmm.
That's what you're doing like the entire year. Uh, Many people do that multiple years. So
Yeah.
it's an enormous corpus. There's an enormous, much, much larger corpus of commentary on it that continues to grow. And so it's an all-encompassing, immersive sort of practice. You don't need to immerse yourself in it. There's a lot to be gained through much, much, much smaller commitments that make room for, employment and things like that. Um, but,
Right,
uh,
right, right.
um, but it also affords and rewards a full immersion. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Could you say a little bit too about the concept of law and love? That there's
Hmm.
joy in law, joy in doing what God has commanded, and kind of like how that dichotomy between like law and grace or whatever that is in Christianity, the how different it is for like the positive nature of God's law in Judaism.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and that certainly goes to the heart of, I guess, addressing or redressing um, the Christian kind of historical teaching of contempt. Um, Yeah, so in the Jewish context, the law is the expression of God's love for Israel. That God enters into a covenant with Israel, and so enters into a relationship with Israel, and the chief manifestation of that relationship is a vision of how best to live in the world, i.e., what
Mhm.
we call the law, halacha, uh, and and yeah, we've spoken, I guess, about the study of it. Of course, there's the basic practice of it, but it is, it's understood then to be a fundamental mark of God's love for the Jewish people. I mean, it raises interesting questions of, right, if the law is good, then why shouldn't it be for everyone, or perhaps it should be for everyone? So, and that gets us into the whole kind of fundamental and very challenging question of Jewish election or chosenness.
Mhm.
But fundamentally, this is the idea of the law, and I mean, what makes it so good? I mean, there are different ways of thinking about that. One is simply that it's God's will, that it's God's command, and the good thing here is to be a servant of God. Um, right, it's the opportunity to carry out God's will, the will of the Creator, the one who took Israel out of Egypt. Um, and then the other way of conceiving of it, which is not incompatible, though there's a certain tension between them, is that this is an expression of divine wisdom.
Mhm.
And so these are laws that embody um, or give expression to a sense of how best it is to live in the world, and that's the way in which they're good. Now, in practice, this can be complicated. I mean, it's pretty straightforward to understand kind of why the laws about theft or helping one's neighbor, um, uh, even kind of the Sabbath and the idea of Sabbath rest. It's pretty easy to understand kind of to make the argument, right, why these kind of represent great ways to live in the world. So the Sabbath can be inconvenient at times, but maybe it's precisely that inconvenience that makes it so great. It's a little harder when it comes to, the laws that we kind of classically think of as ritual laws, the dietary laws, the laws of menstrual purity, which I enter into, and
Mhm.
both of which I enter into in the book. And so there it becomes complicated, and there's a lot to think through about what it means to think of these um, uh, as as good ways to live in the world. I mean, those are certainly points to get back to. I also should mention I haven't really discussed the afterlife at all, but there
I
is
was going to ask you
sort of
about that. Yeah, yeah.
because I mean there certainly is the traditional Jewish belief. There is a traditional Jewish belief in the afterlife, so it's not at all just about this world. There is also a very fundamental idea that the observance of the commandments um, uh, yields merit,
Hmm.
merit for the one who observes them, and God rewards that obedience in the afterlife. So um, uh, I argue in the book that that's not the very central conception of the commandments, the kind of the core kind of good of the commandments. Is in relation to this world as a kind of a corollary of God's kind of covenantal relationship with the Jewish people in this world, realized in the form of a people living on its land. Uh, but certainly the afterlife, while it doesn't figure very much or tough to see it at all in the Hebrew Bible itself in Tanakh,
Hmm.
it certainly becomes a foundational principle for rabbinic Judaism through the ages and remains one today, even if today, of course, in the modern world and with rationalism, etc., there are the kind of that question can be complicated. But the question was already complicated in the medieval world.
Sure, sure, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess to follow up on the question, I'm glad you went there because I was going to ask you about
Yeah.
that next. The I think the one point that you make in the book really helpfully is the idea of meriting, the afterlife. When you put that language into a Christian framework, right? People start getting Martin Luther's anxiety of like who
Yeah.
could merit. It's not like I think you say something along the lines like the person that's just doing their best kind of thing can do that, so it doesn't produce that sort of anxiety for Jewish people the way it does
Right.
for
Right.
Christians.
Yeah, and so right, and not necessarily right for all Christians. I think right. What it's so difficult to make comparisons because we're dealing with like Judaism and Christianity, and there's so
Yeah,
much
yeah,
internal variation. So
yeah.
I always kind of hesitate. Probably I don't qualify as much, or articulate my hesitations as I should. But yeah, but the um the basic understanding right within Judaism is that. Obedience is measured against disobedience, reward against punishment, and one doesn't need to be a perfectly righteous person in order to earn one's share, as it were, in the afterlife. That it follows from God's love of human beings, love of the Jewish people, that uh, uh, that God's expectations aren't set that high. And so to some extent, right, that follows from a principle of divine love. But to some extent, it also is bound up with um, the Jewish commitment to the idea that the commandments find their chief expression and telos in this world. And
Yes.
so the corollary of that is we don't need to worry about the afterworld. Be good, do what you can and you can. People are able. This gets us back to the basically optimistic conception of human nature in Judaism. It is possible to observe the law reasonably well. Um, which is not to say that Judaism doesn't have a conception of sin, doesn't have a conception of the evil inclination, but it is possible to do that. And so that will, as it were, sort itself out if you are, oriented well.
Yeah. And that you brought up, you just alluded to my second point, which I wanted to ask you about, which is that I think, again, this is something that's going to be very counterintuitive to for many Christians to hear, that because the focus on law is something you do in this life, that's part of why there's less focus on the afterlife. I think you used the metaphor of like a stadium, which is interesting because you have a text in the New Testament, the Epistle to Hebrews uses a very similar image.
Yeah.
But it's like if Christianity is oriented towards like getting you to the seat in the stadium, Judaism is more interested in the game being played, which is in this life. And so like once you enter into the seat in the stadium, you can't do the law anymore, which is where it's kind of at, right?
Yeah. And I mean, and there is there is a certain way in which that this distinction plays into a dichotomy of Jewish kind of carnality and the life or bodiliness versus a Christian spirituality. So I don't want to overplay that distinction because the vision of this ideal life in this world is very much, of course, a life with God. And then B, also there is a traditional theological commitment to an afterlife. But I think it is fair to say that the very centrality of the commandments of the Halakha in Judaism does kind of root it, as it were, in a vision of this world. Yeah, I mean, I should say also there is a concept of the eschaton and the potential kind of transformation of the world, and even some conception of aspects of the law going out of fashion, as it were, in that future. And so that is another dimension. Yeah, and it's a dimension I don't really actually deal with all that much in the book, the kind of the eschatological vision of Judaism. But I think except insofar as to say that I think that there is a way in which some of the kind of fundamental theological differences between Judaism and Christianity do stem from a more decisive engagement with, a more decisive commitment to apocalyptic trends, kind of eschatologically oriented trends for Christianity, or for the Jewish circles from which Christianity emerged in the Second Temple period.
I think that's right. I appreciate everything you said there. I mean, I think this may be too simplistic a way of putting it, but if Christianity is kind of committed to the idea that the New Age has already begun in some sense in the coming of the Messiah or something, then that's going to inherently bring in this apocalyptic eon-shifting tension that's not present in the other faith tradition that doesn't think that moment has come.
Right, yeah, with its implications for observance of the law and then many other things. But of course, then you have that conception of the second coming, that kind of a common horizon of expectation that creates a certain kind of common horizon of expectation between Jews and Christians, and that has been certainly invoked in a lot of the frameworks for reconciliation between Jews and Christians, both looking toward that, toward a Messiah who is coming.
Yeah. No, that's great. Gosh, man, there's so many questions I want to ask you here, but I don't want to push their time too far. Maybe just a couple more quick ones. What could you just tell us just briefly about kind of Jewish spirituality today, and what kind of practices, thinkers, ideas are important for people to know? Yeah,
great question. A big question. Yeah, I mean, so a lot of Jewish spirituality today kind of has its roots in a a development kind of far beyond the Hebrew Bible or the Second Temple period, namely Hasidism. Right, Hasidism, spiritual movement that emerges in Eastern Europe and Poland and its environs in the 18th century, and with roots in Kabbalah, what we could probably call Jewish mysticism. But it develops an extensive interest in spiritual practices, in psychology, in the human body and space, song, dance, and so a lot of contemporary Jewish spiritual practices, from song, dance to meditation, uh, come or really draw on Hasidism. So I had this chapter then about Jewish spirituality, and I think I might have been the hardest one to write because, well, I mean, spirituality is itself a difficult category. To some extent, right? People think of spirituality as the alternative to organized religion, but it also is a critical part of organized religion. But to some extent, goes to kind of qualify the very organization of the religion. So yeah, it's pretty complicated. I mean, I don't I guess have a settled view. Maybe I'll say two things. I mean, one is that it's interesting from the perspective of Judaism to think about Christian spiritual practices, and especially, I mean, attractive Christian spiritual practices, and wonder, do we have that within Judaism? If we don't, why? Is it a historical accident, or are there aspects of Jewish theology that make it difficult to find that? So, for example, the idea of joining oneself in various practices to the suffering of Christ, right, and meditation on the cross and the like. Do we have that sort of practice in Judaism, and if not, why? Or if it looks different in Judaism, then why? And of course, the very fact that Judaism rejects the idea of the incarnation of God, Judaism rejects the idea that God takes on human flesh. I think, I mean, it makes it difficult. Even as Judaism has a very rich tradition of God's participation in the suffering of Israel in exile, nevertheless, that stops short of embodiment. Maybe there's a divine flesh that may be a position that's available within Jewish theology, but certainly not human flesh. There is this unbridgeable gap between God and human beings to a degree that there isn't in Christianity, and I think it's fair to say, and that creates a certain limit to that form of spirituality. And so it's interesting to just reflect on that, and well, what do we do with that? So that's one thing that I wanted to mention, and then another is the spiritual is a kind of the spirituality of the collective, right? I mean, I think meditation, right? We think as a kind of spiritual practice, and that almost necessarily implies a certain isolation, right? You're kind of in your mind, and there is a kind of a beautiful sort of range of Jewish spiritual practices that occur kind of specifically in community, and the ability to sort of kind of call to mind in liturgy and song the presence, the imagined presence of the entire Jewish community is I think an important part of Jewish spirituality. And even as we think about spirituality as kind of centered on the individual, there is this kind of interesting dialectic between the experience of the individual and me in relation to God, but then also this presence of the Jewish people.
Yeah, that's really great.
Ideas out there.
Yeah, I love that. That's really great. Okay, last question, if I may. I'd love to ask you just a little bit about the chapter you have on, excuse me, the modernity, Zionism, the Jewish state. I mean, could you just take us, through, again, obviously these are very complicated topics, but just a little bit of an overview of why this is, such a critical topic of conversation, and what are some things that people really need to know to engage in an informed way, kind of in what's going on in our world today?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is an area that is full of minefields and pitfalls and stumbling blocks. So, right, it's a really difficult one. Okay, I'm going to take it back. I said the jurisspirituality chapter was the hardest one to write, but no, these two chapters on on Zionism are the hardest ones to write.
And I
Zionism
think they're the
on the state
last.
of Israel.
Are they the
They're the
last two in
last
the
two.
book? Yeah,
Yeah, they're the last two.
yeah.
I'm not treating Zionism and the state of Israel from a political perspective. I'm treating them entirely from a theological perspective, but these two are, to a certain extent, inseparable. Um, where does one start? I mean, I think, it would be better to say nothing about it, right? That would be the counsel of prudence to just not enter into that minefield. But I think it is so important because there's just the question of Israel and Israel's relationship with Palestinians kind of so dominates the news, obviously, especially October 7th and the post-October 7th moment we are living in. But really, right, the question of Israel and Jews' relationship with the state of Israel, how Christians relate to it, the Jewish how they ought to relate to Jewish sensitivities around this question. So these questions are just so important. So I think it's important to engage in it and to try to seek, to try to treat them with all of the nuance and complexity that they deserve within the space of two chapters. So, and I mean, what would how does one, I don't know that it's possible to summarize it, but I guess, I suppose I did kind of come to a position. I mean, I try not to advocate for a particular position, but instead to kind of lay out different approaches, theological approaches, the history of those approaches, and contemporary approaches. But I think I kind of ultimately do sort of gravitate toward a sense that, given the fact that either now or very soon a majority of Jews will live in the state of Israel, and that the state of Israel is, by its in its essence, the Jewish state. That it's difficult to think of a Jew or a Christian who identifies as religious. I mean, well, a Jew could be an ethnic sense of identification, but for someone who identifies as religious to think about the state of Israel with indifference, or to think about it simply as a citizen of the world and not as a Jew and not as a Christian. It doesn't. I don't. And I want to, I guess, come to maybe a minimalist position that for given the centrality of the category of Jewish peoplehood and the category of the Jewish people within Judaism, one needs to care about one's fellow Jews. So one needs to care about Israel. It doesn't preclude almost any kind of position about what the state of Israel, what the government of Israel might be doing in this or that moment. But it gets us back to the question of the position of the social critic. I think it does compel a kind of sense of identification on the part of Jews with the Jewish people of Israel, and hence the desire for it to be better, if you're critiquing it. And that would be kind of the minimal position, the sense of identification with it. And again, that's the essence of criticism. And it's not just that one can critique, but that to be a social critic, you need to have that sense of identification with the people. And so I guess, right, trending toward that kind of minimalist position on the Jewish side, and then also on the Christian side, where again it's tough to imagine that in a post-supersessionist Christian who thinks of God as maintaining this relationship with the Jewish people, and therefore thinks also of a relationship between the church and the Jewish people. It's tough to see that there couldn't, it's tough to see there not being a sense of engagement with the state of Israel as the home of the majority of Jews in the world, and as the kind of the main locus for the collective expression of the Jewish people in this world. And again, there's no substantive position on anything that the state does that follows from that. It just means that whatever you're doing, you're kind of coming from that sense of identification, and it could kind of emerge in intense criticism, just as it was when seized in the case of the prophets. But it's coming from a sense of well, I think it's fair to say solidarity. But again, solidarity not in the sense of cheerleading. Solidarity simply in the sense of I am bound to this group, and I am bound, therefore, to this. In one way or another. So that's, I guess, there are certainly kind of Christians who have kind of very vocal voices on the state of Israel in the past and today, who are much more in the cheerleading camp, and who are much more in the alienation camp, and the identification with it doesn't enter into their purview at all. And I think, I would push back against both of those positions. And again, ultimately, in a post-supersessionist context, I'm not sure how much any of these arguments is specific to, a Jewish approach or to a Christian approach. I think mutatis mutandis, they end up pretty similar at that minimal position that I was describing. So that's my attempt to navigate that minefield.
No, that's really great. No, I think that's really helpful. I appreciate you doing that in the book and sharing some with us here. Yeah. Is there anything else, like last things you'd like to share about the book? There's so many other things I wanted to ask you about.
I mean, right. There is this attempt over the course of 2 chapters to engage with the question of election.
Yeah.
That was also, I'm not going to change my opinion again. This wasn't the hardest part, right? But those were also really, really hard chapters to write. Election is such a crux for kind of modern Jews, kind of committed to basic kind of liberal kind of concepts of universalism, of tolerance, so that was a really difficult set of ideas to work through and kind of try to convey in all the nuance and with some attentiveness to the variety of views over there. So that could be a long conversation. Yeah, I mean, it was interesting also to me, I guess, to think about, that this is an introduction. This is an introduction both to the history of Christian teaching about Judaism, the history of or the history of Christian theology, of Jewish theology. To what extent did I have anything new to say here? So, and any kind of formulation of a book, is going to introduce something new or some new kind of, it'll hit people differently. It'll hit even a person familiar with these ideas differently and kind of lead to maybe a different set of thoughts. So it's helpful in that respect. But I don't know, I suppose, if you ask kind of about other thinking, I guess I did. I mean, I guess I was kind of happy with the way in which, or thought kind of I had come myself kind of through thinking about the Sabbath in particular, to a better understanding of how it works in, again, traditional Judaism, contemporary mainstream Judaism. These categories are so hard, but kind of thinking about the Sabbath and kind of the holiness of the Sabbath, and the formulation I ended up with there is so the Sabbath is characterized as holy, and so one can think of it. Abraham Joshua Heschel famously characterized it as a sanctuary or a temple in time. But then the kind of the further step that I try to take in the book is to situate the person who observes the Sabbath, who is practicing the Sabbath. Where are they in relation to the temple that is the Sabbath? And so, I hit on the formulation that the distinctively rabbinic Jewish conception of the Sabbath involves a commitment to the idea that the person who is celebrating the Sabbath is not in the temple like a priest, but rather is a certain distance from the temple, kind of basking in the presence of God that kind of emerges from the temple, but at a certain distance. And this explains kind of the way in which the rabbis are committed to the sanctity of the Sabbath is manifested, but through the idea of total rest, but also at the same time are also invested in the idea of enjoyment of the Sabbath. And this marks a contrast between other forms of Judaism historically and even to the present to a certain extent that lean much more heavily into the holiness of the Sabbath as something that precludes basic expressions of human embodiment, like sexuality and even eating. But the rabbis don't go that way. They kind of go in the opposite direction. And then, so one could think of their conception of the Sabbath as not like the priest who kind of can't drink wine because he's serving in the temple or can't have sex because that would defile him, but rather someone who is in the presence and the shadow of the temple, but outside of it. So, I like that formulation.
Yeah.
Throw that out there.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love that too.
Yeah.
That's really wonderful. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much again, everybody. The book, you got to get this book, Judaism, a Guide for
Thank
Christians. You. This is, I can't thank you enough, Tzvi, for this book. It's, for me personally, I know you shared a little bit of my background with you before we got on air, but it's exactly the kind of book I was looking for. So this is really a gift, and I think a gift for many. And I just hope everybody reads it. I think you're going to benefit tremendously from it. So thanks for your scholarship and your wisdom.
No, thank you. Thank you for the great conversation.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure that you are subscribed to our channel for more content. And if you're interested in supporting us, the best way you can do so is by becoming a member of the Center for Bible Study. Link in the description. Thanks.